In 262, the ruins of the cathedral still smolder in the Boneyard. This wasn't a settlement or a trading hub. The walls are scorched black, the vaults beneath collapsed, and the bodies of thousands of converts buried in the rubble. It was the nerve center of the Unity, a movement that came closer to ending humanity than the bombs ever did. At its height, the Unity controlled a network stretching from the Boneyard to the northern wastes. It recruited through persuasion, converted through fear, and grew through something far worse. The cathedral's master didn't just want followers. He wanted to remake the species, one dip at a time, and turn every human in the wasteland into something new. By late 261, the Unity had absorbed entire settlements, fielded an army of super mutants, and stood on the edge of total victory. Then, in a single night, it collapsed. The cathedral exploded, the master died, and the converts scattered into the wasteland like ash. To understand what the cathedral became, we need to see what the wasteland was before it rose. October 23, 2077. The Great War lasted 2 hours. The nuclear exchange between the United States and China vaporized cities, ignited the atmosphere, and killed billions in the first 24 hours. The vaults sealed, the surface burned, and the few who survived emerged into a world where every rule, every border, and every government had turned to radioactive dust. The immediate aftermath was starvation, radiation sickness, and the collapse of every supply chain that kept pre-war America alive. Clean water became currency. Shelter meant the difference between living another week or dying in the fallout. Most survivors didn't make it past the first winter. The ones who did formed scattered tribes, raider gangs, and settlements built from whatever hadn't melted. By 2161, 84 years after the bombs, the wasteland had found a cruel equilibrium. Towns like Junktown and the Hub traded in scrap and water. The new California Republic was still decades away, and the Brotherhood of Steel stayed locked in their bunkers, hoarding technology while the surface starved. But while humans struggled to survive, something else was adapting far faster. Before the war, West Tech Research Facility ran a classified project called the Pan-Immunity Virion. The goal was simple: engineer a virus that made soldiers immune to every biological weapon China could deploy. By 2076, they'd succeeded. The virus rewrote human DNA, accelerated cellular repair, and turned test subjects into something stronger, faster, and nearly indestructible. The military saw potential. They renamed it the Forced Evolutionary Virus, moved the project to Mariposa military base, and kept testing. FEV didn't just immunize, it mutated. Subjects grew in size and strength, but cognitive function deteriorated in 87% of cases. Skin turned gray-green, muscle mass doubled, and the DNA damage was irreversible. The war ended before West Tech could refine it. When the bombs fell, Mariposa's garrison rebelled, executed the scientists, and abandoned the base. The FEV sat in the vaults below, sealed in steel tanks, suspended in a climate-controlled lab built to survive a direct nuclear strike. The virus didn't degrade. It didn't leak. It waited, stable and viable, in the dark beneath the California desert. For decades, Mariposa sat silent in the Californian desert, until one man went looking for answers. Richard Gray was born in 2047, 12 years before the bombs fell. He survived the war as a young boy in Vault 8, one of the few control vaults designed to actually protect its residents. When the vault opened in 2080, Gray emerged with a medical degree earned underground and a mind sharp enough to see the wasteland for what it was, a problem waiting for a solution. He set up practice in the ruins, stitching up raiders and settlers alike, but the violence never stopped. For every wound he closed, 10 more opened somewhere else. Gray started asking questions the other survivors had given up on. Why did humanity default to cruelty? Was it environmental, genetic, cultural? He read everything he could scavenge from the old world, looking for patterns. By 2102, Gray had become something rare in the wasteland. A scientist without a lab, an idealist without a cause, and a doctor who'd stopped believing medicine could fix what was broken. He needed data, samples, anything that might explain why the species kept tearing itself apart. Gray wasn't searching for power. He was searching for a cure to human cruelty itself. In April 2102, Gray heard rumors from a caravan guard about a sealed military base south of the hub, Mariposa. The name meant nothing to most wastelanders, but Gray had read enough pre-war files to know it had been a research site. He assembled a small team, a mutated trader named Harold, a few hired guns, and a scavenger who claimed to know the way. The journey took 11 days through irradiated zones and feral ghoul territory. When they finally reached Mariposa, they found the blast doors sealed but not destroyed. The base had survived the war intact. Harold later recalled that Gray spent an hour just staring at the entrance, running calculations in his head. The locks were electronic, the power still humming faintly through the structure. Functional, waiting. They breached the outer door on day 3, using a salvaged military keycard and a lot of luck. Inside, the air was stale but breathable. Emergency lighting flickered on as they descended. The base wasn't abandoned. It was automated, still running its programming, 45 years after the last human walked out. What they found inside would have been safer left buried. The storage level stretched out like a cathedral of steel and glass. Massive cylindrical vats, 4 meters tall, lined the walls in perfect rows. Each one was filled with a thick, luminescent green liquid that pulsed faintly under the emergency lights. Gray's Geiger counter stayed silent. Not radioactive. Something else. Harold remembered the smell. Metallic, organic, wrong. They found a terminal still logged in. Records dated October 2077. Forced evolutionary virus. Military grade. 87% viability at room temperature. Gray read the files for 2 hours, while the others grew nervous. The vats were still sealed, still pressurized, still viable after 25 years in the dark. He started taking samples. Harold tried to pull him away, argued they should leave. But Gray had that look, the one that said he'd found his answer. Then the base woke up. Motion sensors tripped, automated turrets deployed from the ceiling, and the vat chamber sealed itself. The team scattered, scrambling for the exits as gunfire tore through the corridors. Harold made it to the stairwell. 2 of the hired guns made it to the blast doors. Gray ran the wrong direction, back toward the vats, clutching his samples. Harold heard him shouting something about the data, about understanding. Gray never made it to the exit. The catwalk gave way. Gray plunged into the vat below, samples still clutched in one hand, his body breaking the surface of the forced evolutionary virus in its raw, concentrated form. Harold made it to the exit. Gray did not. For 30 days, Richard Gray was submerged. The FEV didn't kill him. It rewrote him, cell by cell, dissolving tissue and reconstituting it in patterns the virus dictated. His nervous system fused with the machinery around him, with the steel and concrete of the vat itself. His mind fractured under the process. Memories splintered, reformed, expanded in directions human neurology was never meant to accommodate. The man who'd descended into Mariposa to save the wasteland spent a month drowning in his own transformation, conscious for all of it. When he finally crawled out, Richard Gray no longer existed, not as one man, anyway. What emerged from the vats was a biomass. Gray's body had fused with the structure of the base itself, flesh webbed through metal, multiple brains networked into a single consciousness. He could feel the thoughts of the tissue he'd absorbed, the genetic memory written into the FEV. His awareness returned in fragments over weeks. He remembered Gray's ideals, the doctor's dream of fixing a broken world. But the perspective had shifted. He wasn't human anymore, and from where he now existed, humanity looked different, smaller, flawed at the architectural level. The telepathic reach came next. He could sense minds at a distance, read intent, project thought. The base became his body, the FEV, his language. He began testing, refining the process, using equipment Gray had once operated with hands. He spent years in that base, alone, thinking, and he came to a conclusion. Humanity's problem, he decided, wasn't resources or technology. It was humanity itself, tribalism, violence, the 100-year lifespan that made every generation relearn the same mistakes. You couldn't negotiate peace between groups, hardwired to see each other as other. But the FEV offered a solution: transform the species, turn every human into a super mutant, stronger, longer-lived, resistant to radiation. More importantly, reshape them at a cognitive level. Remove the biological triggers for tribalism. Make them one people, incapable of the old hatreds. He called it the unity, not conquest in his mind. Salvation, a single unified species that could finally stop tearing itself apart. The Master wasn't trying to destroy humanity. He was trying to perfect it by erasing what made it human in the first place. But philosophy needs foot soldiers. The first subjects came from the surface, scavengers who wandered too close to Mariposa, traders following rumors of salvage, wastelanders who simply vanished from their camps one night. The Master's network of psychic thralls brought them down, one by one, to the vats. The transformations were brutal. FEV rewrote their bodies in minutes, muscle tearing and rebuilding, bones thickening, skin hardening into gray-green armor. Strength came easily. Intelligence didn't. Early super mutants emerged confused, violent, their minds shattered by the change. The Master watched, adjusted, learned. He discovered that psychological conditioning immediately after transformation improved results. Subjects who heard his voice during the change, who felt his psychic presence guiding them through the pain, came out more stable, more loyal. The process was still imperfect, but it was improving. By 2103, he'd created over 100 super mutants. Most were simple soldiers, their minds reduced to following orders and crushing resistance. But a few retained something more. One of those early subjects would become his greatest lieutenant. The records don't say who he was before. No name, no vault, no settlement. What's known is that his transformation in 2102 was unusually successful. He kept his intellect, his tactical mind, his ability to plan beyond the next fight, and he emerged with something the Master needed desperately: absolute faith in the unity. The lieutenant became the Master's right hand. Where the Master was vision and philosophy, the lieutenant was execution. He organized the growing mutant army into squads, established patrol routes around Mariposa, coordinated raids for new subjects. He translated psychic whispers into military strategy. He also recruited. The lieutenant had a gift for identifying wastelanders who might survive the transformation with their minds intact. Former soldiers, caravan guards, anyone with discipline and purpose. He'd talk to them first, in that deep, rumbling voice all super mutants shared, explaining what they'd become. Some volunteered. By 2130, the lieutenant commanded over 500 super mutants across Southern California. He was ruthlessly efficient, utterly loyal, and completely convinced that the Master's vision would save humanity. But a growing army of mutants needed more than muscle. It needed a face the wasteland could trust. Morpheus was a preacher before he was a prophet. He'd wandered the wastes for years, village to village, offering hope to settlements that had none. Unity through faith, strength through community, salvation through surrender to something greater than yourself. Standard wasteland gospel. Then in 252, he met something that actually answered. The Master's psychic reach had grown. When Morpheus came within range of the cathedral, still under construction, he heard a voice that promised everything he'd been preaching. A real unity, biological and unbreakable, evolutionary perfection, an end to war, hunger, and the petty tribalism tearing humanity apart. Morpheus walked into the vault beneath the cathedral and never left the same. What's remarkable is that Morpheus never dipped. The Master kept him human, recognizing that the unity needed a prophet who could move freely, who could smile and shake hands and preach to crowds without terrifying them. Morpheus became the public face, the charismatic leader who'd recruit where the lieutenant's mutants could only intimidate. He founded the Children of the Cathedral in 2155, officially a religious movement, preaching peace and unity. Secretly, a recruitment pipeline feeding the Master's vats. Morpheus believed every word. To him, transformation wasn't horror, it was transcendence, and those converts needed a place to gather, to worship, to become something new. The Master needed a place to build his church, somewhere broken enough that no one asked questions, but populated enough to provide converts. He chose the Boneyard, the skeletal remains of Los Angeles, sprawled across the Southern California wasteland like a corpse picked clean by scavengers. By 2152, the Boneyard wasn't a city anymore. It was a patchwork of gang territories, refugee camps, and scavenger settlements with names like Aditum and the Gunrunners. No central authority, no organized law, just survivors carving out whatever they could from the ruins of the old world. Perfect, in other words, for something that needed to hide in plain sight. The gangs controlled their blocks, the traders moved through neutral zones, and nobody looked too closely at what happened in the dead zones between territories. In 2152, construction began on the largest structure the Boneyard had seen since the bombs fell. The building itself was pre-war, a massive stone structure that had survived the initial blasts mostly intact. The Master's followers gutted it, reinforced it, expanded it. Steel plating scavenged from collapsed skyscrapers. Concrete poured over framework, salvaged from highway overpasses. The aesthetic was part Gothic cathedral, part wasteland fortress. Above ground, it looked like what it claimed to be. A church, complete with stained glass windows scavenged from a dozen ruined chapels, and a bell tower that could be seen for miles. Below ground, the real work happened. Barracks for the faithful, laboratories for the initiated, and deep beneath it all, FEV dipping chambers, where conversion took place. The construction took months. Hundreds of workers, many of them mutants already loyal to the Master, others refugees paid in food and water, who never asked what they were building. Layer by layer, the cathedral rose, a monument to unity, built on secrets and subterranean horrors. The cathedral opened its doors to the desperate, the faithful, and the curious, and very few left the same way they entered. On the surface, the cathedral was run by the Children of the Cathedral, a humanitarian organization that showed up in settlements across the wasteland, offering food, medical supplies, and hope. They wore robes, they smiled, they never asked for anything in return. To the starving and the sick, they looked like angels. The children preached a simple message: unity, peace, an end to the violence that had consumed humanity for a century. They recruited from the hopeless, the idealistic, the broken. New initiates started with community service, distributing aid and tending to the injured. Slowly, carefully, they were introduced to deeper teachings about transcendence and the flaws of the old flesh. The organization had a structure, a hierarchy of devotion. Junior members never saw the labs. Senior priests knew pieces of the truth, but rationalized it as necessary sacrifice. And at the top, the inner circle, the true believers who had looked into the vats and understood. Most initiates never learned what unity really meant until it was too late. The cathedral operated on 3 tiers of knowledge, each sealed from the others. On the surface, thousands of ordinary initiates distributed food, ran clinics, welcomed refugees. They believed they'd joined a humanitarian movement. These were true believers in the kindest sense, people who genuinely thought they were saving the wasteland through charity and faith. The middle tier, the acolytes, knew more. They'd seen the super mutants. They'd been told these towering creatures were guardians, evolved protectors, who would shield humanity from raiders and worse. Some had even witnessed conversions, told it was a sacred ascension for the chosen. The cognitive dissonance was managed through ritual, through Morpheus's sermons, through the promise that pain served a higher purpose. At the top sat the inner circle, maybe 20 people who understood the Master's true plan, who knew unity meant dissolution of self into a collective consciousness. They'd stood at the vats. They'd heard the Master's voice in their minds, felt the edges of something vast and alien. These were the architects, coordinating kidnappings, managing supply lines of human stock, spinning cover stories when entire caravans vanished. Compartmentalization kept the system running. An initiate feeding children in the hub had no idea those same children might be selected for the vats in 6 months. An acolyte escorting captives to the cathedral didn't know the vault existed. Only Morpheus saw every piece. And beneath even the inner circle, something else was growing. The cathedral itself was a shell. Beneath the prayer halls and dormitories, beneath even the secured floors where acolytes prepared captives, a network of tunnels descended into the earth. They led to a vault, a military installation that predated the war, connected to the old Mariposa complex. Through subterranean passages, the Master had spent years excavating and expanding. This was the Master's true seat, not a throne room but a biomass chamber where his flesh had grown into the walls, into the machinery, into the FEV vats that bubbled and hissed in the darkness. The largest vats were here, industrial scale, capable of processing dozens of humans at once. Super mutants stood guard in shifts, 8 feet of muscle and loyalty bred from the same green horror that had created their god. The vault's layout was deliberate. Conversion chambers radiated from the Master's core, then barracks for his mutant army, then armories stocked with pre-war weapons, then holding cells. Captives brought to the cathedral on the surface were funneled down through hidden elevators, sorted, catalogued. The efficient ones became mutants. The psionically sensitive were brought directly to the Master for deeper integration. Security was absolute. Only the Lieutenant and Morpheus knew the full path. The inner circle accessed specific sections on need. Most super mutants had never seen the surface cathedral. Most cathedral priests had never descended past the first sublevel. 2 organizations, 1 mission, separated by 100 feet of reinforced concrete and secrecy. From that vault, the Master's telepathic voice reached every corner of his growing empire. By 255, the Master's network stretched across Southern California. Cathedral missions opened in the hub, Junktown, even the ghoul city of Necropolis. Each outpost followed the same model: charity first, conversion later. The hub's water merchants saw cathedral volunteers feeding the desperate. Junktown's mayor welcomed their aid with the raiders. In Necropolis, they offered ghouls a place in unity. Acceptance, the smooth skins denied them. Super mutant patrols became a common sight on trade routes. At first, merchants were terrified. Then the mutants started killing raiders, defending caravans, asking nothing in return. The Master's propaganda was elegant. See, the monsters protect you. See, they want peace. Caravans that cooperated got safe passage. Caravans that asked too many questions, that refused cathedral escorts, that tried to map mutant movements. Those caravans disappeared into the night. 47 confirmed vanishings between 2155 and 2161. according to hub records. Entire settlements were absorbed. A town suffering raider attacks would welcome Cathedral aid. Within months, half the population would be converts. Within a year, the non-believers would leave or vanish. The town would remain, functioning, trade continuing, but now it served the master. Scouts reported whole communities where everyone wore cathedral robes, where super mutants walked freely, where questions about missing neighbors were met with serene smiles and scripture. The master was patient. He had time. Every month brought more mutants, more converts, more territory. The hub's council debated intervention, but feared open war. The Brotherhood of Steel watched from their bunker, cataloging but not acting. By 2161, the cathedral claimed 12,000 faithful across 30 settlements. The Master's telepathic network connected 400 super mutants and growing. But the Master's grand plan had one critical flaw, and he didn't know it yet. The FEV didn't just rewrite DNA. It rewrote everything, cellular level up, optimizing for strength and resilience. What it couldn't do was preserve reproductive viability. The virus damaged gametes during transformation, rendering nearly every super mutant sterile. The Master didn't know. His telepathic network connected minds, not biology labs. He saw his children grow stronger, smarter, unified. He didn't see that the unity was one generation deep, with no second coming. Every dip into the vats produced soldiers for a war that would end the moment it was won. The few exceptions, mutants who retained fertility, were so rare they'd never sustain a species. The Master's grand vision of humanity ascending into a new evolutionary phase had a built-in extinction clock. His paradise would live as long as his current army, then silence. While the Master refined his dream, the hub was starting to ask dangerous questions. The hub didn't care about ideology. It cared about caps and caravans. By mid-2161, 7 trade routes had gone dark in 4 months. Merchants who'd run the same roads for years suddenly vanished between settlements. The ones who came back talked about a cathedral, salvation, unity. They quit their routes, walked south, and never returned. The Water Merchants Guild started tracking it. Decker's crew noticed the pattern first. Disappearances clustered around Boneyard-adjacent routes. Refugees passing through spoke of a massive structure, crowds in robes, a voice that promised an end to suffering. The hub's council didn't trust promises. They trusted ledgers, and the ledgers showed hemorrhaging trade. Then there were the ones who came back changed. Traders who'd been cynical, hardened by years in the wastes, suddenly preaching about transcendence and a new humanity. Their eyes had a faraway quality, like they were listening to something no one else could hear. The council started assigning armed escorts to every caravan headed southwest. One caravan returned with a story that sparked the first organized resistance. 150 miles northeast, Vault 13 had a different crisis. On October 23, 2161, the water chip regulating the vault's purification system failed. No backup, no spare parts. The overseer, Jacorin, ran the numbers. 150 days of water reserves, maybe less if rationing sparked panic. The vault had survived 84 years sealed. It would die of thirst in 5 months. Jacorin made the call no overseer wants to make. Someone had to go topside, find a replacement chip, and bring it back. Vault-Tec records suggested other vaults might have spares, but the locations were scattered, and the surface was a mystery. The chosen dweller got a Pip-Boy, a 10mm pistol, a canteen, and a simple mission: find the chip, come home, save the vault. No briefing mentioned super mutants. No one in Vault 13 had heard of the Master, the Unity, or the Cathedral. The mission was mechanical, survival logistics. Get the part, return, close the door. The Vault Dweller stepped into the Mojave sun on December 5, 2161, with 150 days on the clock and zero context for the war already underway. The Vault Dweller's search would lead them into the Master's path, but not for months yet. The first settlement they found was Shady Sands, a small farming community built around a single well. The people were friendly enough, cautious of strangers but willing to trade. They warned about rad scorpions to the east and raiders to the south, drew a rough map in the dirt pointing toward a trading hub further west. The Vault Dweller kept moving. Every conversation was the same pattern. Ask about water, ask about technology, ask if anyone knew where a water chip might be. Most people had never heard of one. A few pointed toward scavenger towns or old military sites, places that might have pre-war tech. In Junktown, they killed their first raiders, helped a shopkeeper with a local gang problem, and started to understand how wasteland politics worked. Everyone wanted something, everyone owed someone else, and survival meant picking sides carefully. The water chip search continued, one lead at a time, each one more vague than the last. But in Junktown, they heard a name that would keep coming up: the Children of the Cathedral. The hub was bigger, louder, more organized. 4 distinct districts, each controlled by a different caravan company, all of them moving goods across the wasteland on routes they'd spent years securing. The traders had seen things, heard stories from every corner of what used to be Southern California. The cathedral came up in half those conversations. Some called it a charity, said they fed the poor and healed the sick for free. Others called it a cult, said the sermons went on for hours, and the recruits had that hollow look in their eyes. People joined willingly, walked through the doors smiling, and were never heard from again. One caravan guard described an escort detail he'd seen on the road south. 3 massive figures, 8 feet tall with green skin and muscles like Brahmin, walking alongside a group of new converts. The figures didn't speak, didn't stop, just kept the group moving toward the Boneyard. He'd turned his caravan around rather than past them. No one had proof of anything wrong. Not really. Just the unease that came from watching people disappear into something and never come back out. And then the Vault Dweller met someone who had escaped. His name was Marcus, though probably not the one he'd been born with. He'd joined the children 8 months earlier in Junktown, desperate and starving, and they'd fed him, given him a bed, told him he was part of something greater. The first 2 months were sermons and community work, helping distribute food to other settlements, learning the hymns. Then they started talking about advancement, about initiates who showed true faith being chosen for a deeper understanding, taken below the cathedral into the sanctum where the real work happened. Marcus had seen 6 people selected for that honor. None of them ever came back up. He'd asked once, carefully, what happened to those who descended. A senior member smiled and said they'd been blessed, that they served the unity now in ways surface dwellers couldn't understand. Marcus started watching the lower entrances after that, noticed the guards, noticed how initiates who asked too many questions got selected next. He ran during a supply trip to the hub, slipped away from the caravan, and never looked back. He didn't know what was in those lower levels, didn't know what the unity actually meant, but he knew enough to warn anyone who'd listen. The Vault Dweller still needed a water chip, but now they had a second trail to follow. Necropolis sat in the ruins of Bakersfield, a city of ghouls who'd survived the bombs and the radiation that followed. Set ruled the place, kept order among the smooth-skin's worst nightmare made flesh. They weren't monsters, just people dealt a cruel hand by fallout and time. But the ghouls weren't alone. Super mutant patrols walked the streets, checked in on the population, made sure nobody got ideas about leaving. Set tolerated them because he had no choice. The mutants were armed, organized, and they answered to someone they called the Master. The Vault Dweller pressed for details. Where did these patrols come from? Who was giving the orders? Set didn't know much, but he knew enough to stay out of their way. The mutants came and went on a schedule, always headed back to the same place when their rounds were done. The ghouls knew where the mutants came from, a place called Mariposa. Mariposa military base was a fortress even after the war. Concrete walls, guard towers, and a garrison of super mutants who didn't sleep, didn't slack, didn't make the mistakes human soldiers would. Getting inside meant patience, timing, and a willingness to crawl through places the mutants assumed were too small or too toxic to bother with. The lower levels told the story the surface tried to hide. FEV vats still hummed with power, green liquid glowing in the dark. Logs scattered across terminals detailed Gray's expedition, the discovery of the vats, the first exposures. This wasn't a mutation, wasn't some quirk of radiation. Someone was making super mutants, dipping humans into the vats one by one. The base had everything needed for production: containment cells, processing equipment, records tracking batches, and success rates. Mariposa was a factory, efficient and cold, turning wastelanders into soldiers for an army that kept growing. But a factory needs a foreman, needs someone to set the quotas and define success. But Mariposa was only a factory. The architect was somewhere else. The lieutenant wasn't like the other mutants. He spoke clearly, thought strategically, and when cornered, he didn't fight, he lectured. The master's plan wasn't conquest, it was salvation. Humanity was dying, poisoned by radiation and tribal warfare. The Unity offered something better: strength, immunity, purpose. Super mutants didn't age, didn't get sick, didn't tear themselves apart over scraps. They were the next step, the species humanity should have been, if the bombs had never fallen. The Cathedral wasn't a front, it was the recruitment center. Willing converts came for faith and left for the vats. Everyone else was just raw material, waiting to be processed. The lieutenant believed every word. His fanaticism wasn't madness, it was conviction, forged in certainty. He'd seen the master's vision, understood the logic, accepted the necessity of what had to be done. In his eyes, the Vault Dweller was the one who didn't understand, clinging to a dead species' last gasps. The Vault Dweller now understood the threat, but not yet its scale. The Vault Dweller brought the evidence to Lost Hills, the Brotherhood of Steel's bunker fortress in the mountains southwest of the hub. The Brotherhood had been monitoring wasteland activity through reconnaissance patrols for decades, cataloging threats and hoarding pre-war technology. When the Vault Dweller laid out the mutant threat, the recordings from Mariposa, and the lieutenant's words, the Paladins didn't dismiss it. They'd seen the abductions too. Their scouts had tracked super mutant patrols back toward the Boneyard, noted the caravans that disappeared near Cathedral territory. High Elder Maxon reviewed the intel and confirmed what the Vault Dweller suspected. The Master was real, and the Cathedral in the Boneyard was the operational nerve center. The Brotherhood's own reconnaissance, guided by the Promise Map's cryptic markings, placed the Master somewhere beneath the Cathedral complex, in vaults the surface believers never saw. They shared maps, structural data salvaged from old city records, and confirmed that Mariposa was the production facility, but the Cathedral was command. The Brotherhood offered weapons and knowledge, but they would not march on the Cathedral themselves. The Vault Dweller's options narrowed to two. A frontal assault was suicide. The Cathedral sat in the heart of the Boneyard, surrounded by civilians, believers, and concealed mutant guards. But infiltration as a prospective recruit might work. The children of the Cathedral welcomed new members, preached openness, and the surface levels were famously accessible. Preparation took weeks. The Vault Dwellers studied the children's rhetoric from traders who'd listened to their sermons, memorized Morpheus's talking points about unity and peace. They gathered robes that matched the initiate's dress, forged a travel history that explained why a vault dweller would seek the cathedral now. The story had to be believable. Someone disillusioned with vault life, drawn to the promise of community. The Brotherhood provided one critical piece of intel. There were lower levels, accessible only to senior members, and never mentioned in recruitment sermons. That's where the vault dweller needed to go. On a cold morning, in late 2162, the vault dweller walked through the cathedral's front doors. The surface level was exactly as the traders described. Clean hallways, polished floors, believers in robes distributing food to Boneyard refugees. No visible weapons, no mutants, just calm efficiency and the low hum of prayer. Morpheus himself delivered a sermon that afternoon. Peace through unity, strength through collective purpose. The old world's divisions finally healed. The vault dweller played the role, nodded at the right moments, took the offered meal, asked questions a curious recruit would ask. Other initiates shared their stories. Farmers whose crops had failed, scavengers tired of violence, people who wanted to believe the wasteland could be something better. Most of them meant it. They had no idea what lived below. For 3 days, the vault dweller moved through the cathedral's rhythms, watching the patterns. Which hallways the senior members used, which doors stayed locked, where the guards positioned themselves when they thought no one was looking. That night, they found it, a guarded door the initiates were never supposed to see. The guards went down quietly. Beyond the door, a stairwell descended into bedrock, carved out decades before the war. The first sublevel held barracks, with cots built for frames 8 feet tall, ammunition crates stenciled with super mutant squad designations, requisition logs tracking deployments across California. One level down, the holding cells. Rows of them, maybe 40 in all, each one occupied. Men and women from the caravans, from settlements the children had visited with food and medicine. They weren't prisoners, not yet. The logs called them candidates. Intake dates, health assessments, FEV compatibility ratings, written in clinical shorthand. The third sublevel was a laboratory. Active FEV research, vats of the green viral suspension connected to monitoring equipment that still blinked with pre-war reliability. Dissection tables, gene sequencers running comparisons between human and super mutant tissue samples. A whiteboard covered in mutation rate projections, logistical bottlenecks in the dipping process. The air smelled like copper and formaldehyde. Every sign of the charity above had dissolved into something industrial, efficient, scaled for mass production. And at the bottom, a vault door sealed with pre-war technology, still operational after 80 years. The door opened to a chamber that shouldn't have been possible. 50 feet high, carved from the mountain itself, lit by banks of monitors that covered every wall. And at the center, a mass of flesh fused with steel and circuitry, where organic tissue flowed into conduits, cables, processors. The thing had been human once. You could see fragments of the original form buried in the biomass. A face here, an arm there, absorbed into something larger. Tubes pulsed with FEV. Screens flickered with data from across the wasteland. Surveillance feeds, transmission logs, troop movements. It was alive, aware, thinking with 100 brains wired into a single consciousness. When it spoke, the voice came from everywhere, with multiple voices layered into harmony, calm and rational and utterly certain. "I have been watching you," it said, "since Shady Sands, since Junktown. Every step you took, every question you asked, brought you here. No anger, no threat. Just a statement of fact from something that had seen it all through 1,000 eyes." The vault dweller raised their weapon. The master, because that's what it was, didn't move. The screens continued their flicker, the biomass its slow pulse. The master did not attack. He wanted to talk. The master explained the unity like a mathematician proving a theorem. Humanity's old divisions, such as race, nation, and ideology, had brought nuclear fire. Super mutants felt no prejudice, knew no greed, lived for centuries without decay. One consciousness, one purpose, one species free from the flaws that had destroyed the world. He offered a choice: undergo transformation willingly, retain your intelligence, your memories, your sense of self, all while being freed from the limitations of human frailty. Help lead the new world, guide the Unity's expansion across the continent, or refuse and die resisting an evolution that would happen whether you accepted it or not. It wasn't a villain's monologue. The Master spoke with the patience of a teacher, quoting philosophy, citing historical atrocities humanity had committed against itself, presenting FEV conversion as the logical solution to a species that couldn't stop tearing itself apart. He believed it, every word. He was offering salvation, not conquest. The screens showed his vision: settlements across California, populations converted peacefully. The children's network expanded into a continental infrastructure, war and suffering erased from human experience. A future without vaults, without radiation, without fear. But the Vault Dweller had found something in the Master's own records that he had overlooked. The Vault Dweller slid a holotape across the console. The data was unambiguous. Every test subject exposed to FEV showed complete reproductive sterility within 72 hours of transformation. The Master's own records confirmed it, buried in thousands of pages of biological reports he'd skimmed but never synthesized. The super mutants couldn't reproduce. The Nightkin couldn't reproduce. The entire population of the Unity, every converted human across California, was biologically incapable of creating a next generation. There would be no children in the Master's new world, no families, no future. The dream ended in 80 years, maybe 100, a single human lifespan, and then extinction. All the planning, all the conversions, all the violence, justified in service of peace, it led to a gentle apocalypse no missile could match. The Master had built a bridge to nowhere and called it salvation. For 30 seconds, the Master was silent. Then the biomass began to move, tendrils retracting, organs pulsing in patterns the Vault Dweller couldn't read. The Master was cross-referencing, pulling files from terminals across the vault, running calculations that should have been run 30 years earlier. Every database confirmed it, every test log, every medical scan, every biological marker pointed to the same conclusion. His voice fractured. One persona screamed that the data was falsified, planted by Vault Tech as sabotage. Another recalculated breeding rates with dwindling human populations, trying to find a mathematical path forward. A third simply repeated the word "no" in a loop, the sound distorting as it passed through vocal cords that had long ago stopped being human. Richard Gray had spent 3 decades building the Unity. The Cathedral held 400 believers. The vats had transformed over 1,000 humans. The lieutenant commanded an army, and none of it mattered, because he'd missed the single most important variable in his equation for saving humanity. And then he made a choice that surprised even the Vault Dweller. The Master's tendrils reached for the Vault's control systems, not to attack, to initiate a countdown, the self-destruct sequence, a fail-safe built into every military installation, designed to prevent enemy capture. He set the timer for 5 minutes and locked it. No override, no abort codes. He told the Vault Dweller to run, to leave the vault, to survive, to tell the wasteland what he'd tried to build and why it couldn't work. His voice was quieter now, fewer personas speaking, the chorus fading to something almost singular. He'd wanted to save humanity from itself, and instead, he'd become one more monster the wasteland would remember. The Vault Dweller didn't argue, didn't try to convince him there was another way, didn't plead for the lives about to be lost. There was nothing left to say. The countdown ticked past 4 minutes as the Vault Dweller sprinted for the elevator, past the vats, still churning, past terminals, still calculating a future that would never arrive. Above, the cathedral was still full of believers who had no idea what was about to happen. The alarms triggered 30 seconds after the dweller left the master's chamber. Klaxons echoed through every corridor of the vault, and something else happened that no one expected. Super mutants across the lower levels, the ones who'd been psionically linked to the master for months or years, collapsed where they stood. Some clutched their heads and screamed. Others just stopped moving, staring at nothing, their connections severed mid-thought. The rest fought. The dweller made it through 3 firefights on the way back up, burning through stim packs and ammunition, because the mutants who weren't telepathically bound had no intention of letting anyone leave. The elevator ride to the cathedral basement felt like it took an hour. It took 40 seconds. The dweller burst into the cathedral's ground floor and started shouting, "Fire! Evacuation! Get out!" Most of the children thought it was a drill. Morpheus had run them before. They filed toward the exits in near silence, conditioned and obedient, while a handful of nightkin watched from the shadows and did nothing to stop them. The cathedral had 2 minutes left. The blast came from below, the vault's nuclear failsafe, designed in 2077 to prevent exactly this kind of contamination scenario, detonated 150 feet underground. The master's biomass vaporized instantly. The FEV tanks ruptured and burned. The shockwave tore through support columns and load-bearing walls, and the cathedral's foundation just ceased to exist. The building didn't explode outward. It fell. The entire structure, stone by stone, collapsed into the crater that had been the vault, dragging down pews and altars and banners and everything Morpheus had built in the name of unity. The blast was contained, mostly. A plume of dust and smoke rose over the Boneyard, visible for miles, but no radiation reached the surface. The children who'd made it out stood in the street, coughing and staring. Some were crying, most were silent. Morpheus was nowhere to be found. The nightkin had vanished. No one gave orders. No one explained what had happened or what to do next. In a single night, the most organized faction in the wasteland ceased to exist. The vault dweller didn't wait. With the master dead, Mariposa was next. Brotherhood forces moved in 48 hours later, January 1st, 2162, and found the base in chaos. The super mutants there had felt it when the master died, the same psychic rupture that hit the ones in the vault. They fought, but not as a unit. No coordination, no tactics, just rage and confusion. The assault took 6 hours. Brotherhood paladins secured the upper levels, while the vault dweller descended into the FEV labs, past vats, still full of the green liquid that had created the master's army. The base had its own self-destruct system, installed by the military in 2077. The dweller triggered it and ran. Mariposa's entrance collapsed under tons of rubble and reinforced steel. The vats were buried, the FEV samples were destroyed or sealed so deep no one would find them for decades. The threat, the original threat that had started all of this, was neutralized. But the children of the cathedral did not all die that night. The people who wore those red robes weren't all fanatics, and they weren't all in the building when it came down. Many of the children were scattered across the wasteland when the cathedral fell, running clinics in the hub, spreading the faith in Aditum, tending the sick in a dozen small settlements that never knew what the church really wanted. Word of the master's death reached them slowly, in rumors that didn't quite line up. Some of them simply took off their robes and walked away, relieved to be free of something they'd only half understood. Others tried to keep the organization breathing, holding services for a god who no longer answered. And a few, the true believers, refused to accept any of it. They kept preaching unity, kept promising a world without division, long after the man who invented that dream was gone. Cut off from Mariposa and its FEV, they had no way to make new mutants and no way to prove anything. They were a headless faith, drifting. Morpheus himself survived the blast, and his fate would become one of the wasteland's enduring mysteries. Morpheus had been the Master's voice, the smooth, charismatic frontman who recruited the desperate and turned them toward the vats. When the cathedral fell, he slipped out of the story almost entirely. There's no confirmed sighting of him anywhere after 2162, which for a man that prominent is strange all on its own. The accounts that survive don't agree. One says he fled east and vanished into the ruins, just another traveler nobody thought to remember. Another claims hub merchants, furious at how the church had bled them dry, caught up with him and executed him quietly. A Brotherhood report offers the saddest version of all. In that telling, Morpheus finally learned what the Master had learned at the end, that the super mutants couldn't reproduce, that unity was a dead road, and he took his own life rather than carry that knowledge any further. We'll probably never know which one is true. The super mutants, meanwhile, faced an identity crisis. For the mutants, the Master hadn't just been a leader. He'd been a purpose, a father, the reason they existed at all. With him gone, thousands of them were left standing in the ruins of a plan they'd been built to serve, and no one left to give them orders. They didn't stay together. Some, like Marcus, looked at the violence they'd been made for and quietly set it down, deciding they'd rather build something than burn it. Others went the opposite way, carving out little kingdoms of fear, turning their strength into banditry and warlordism, because it was the only language they'd been taught. And a stubborn few kept chasing the old dream, hunting for a cure to the sterility, convinced unity could still be saved if they just found the right piece. The mutant population fractured, went nomadic, scattered across the map in bands that trusted almost no one. One group, however, would take the Master's ideology in a darker direction. The Nightkin were the Master's elite, first-generation super mutants, hand-picked for stealth operations, equipped with stealth boys, pre-war military cloaking devices that bent light around the wearer. They'd slip through enemy lines invisible, hit hard, vanish before anyone knew what happened. But stealth boys weren't meant for extended use. The field they generated interfered with brain chemistry, and the Nightkin used them constantly, for years. After the cathedral fell, they couldn't stop. Addiction took hold. The paranoia came first, a creeping certainty that everyone could see them, that the invisibility was failing, that they were being watched. Then the schizophrenia set in. Nightkin started hearing voices, seeing threats that weren't there, fragmenting into violent episodes they couldn't remember. They became nomadic hunters, haunting ruins and cave systems, attacking travelers on suspicion alone. Some forgot why they were hiding. Others invented elaborate conspiracies to explain the emptiness in their heads. By the 2280s, Nightkin were considered the most dangerous super mutant variant, unpredictable and paranoid, clinging to broken stealth boys like religious artifacts. They were Unity's shadow operators, and the shadows had consumed them. But the Master's legacy was not limited to those he transformed. In 2242, the Enclave, the remnants of the pre-war United States government hiding on an oil rig off the California coast, recovered FEV research data from Mariposa. They'd been watching the mutant population for years, cataloging the Master's work through salvaged holotapes and interrogation of captured subjects. What they saw wasn't a failed utopia. It was a prototype. The Enclave's plan was clinical. They would weaponize a modified FEV strain, release it into the jet stream, and kill every mutated organism on the planet. Super mutants, ghouls, anyone with even trace radiation exposure, gone in weeks. They called it the salvation of humanity. In practice, it was extinction, with a 98% casualty rate. The Master had wanted to elevate humanity through forced evolution. The Enclave wanted to purify it through genocide, using the same technology, the same labs, even some of the same scientists' notes. They saw his sterility flaw not as a tragedy, but as an engineering problem, one they could solve by simply killing the imperfect rather than converting them. The Chosen One stopped them in 2242, destroyed the oil rig, ended the plan. But the Enclave's interest in FEV didn't die with their leadership. Splinter cells kept the research, kept refining it, kept looking for ways to finish what they started. And in the East, another faction would find the Master's writings and draw very different conclusions. The Institute, buried beneath the ruins of MIT and the Commonwealth, had no direct contact with the Master's army. But in 2178, their scientists recovered pre-war FEV documentation from a federal bioweapons archive. They studied it, not to create supermutants, but to understand the principles: forced evolution, manufactured improvement, the replacement of flawed baseline humanity with something controllable. By 2227, they'd built their own version: synths, artificial humans grown in labs, programmed for loyalty, designed to infiltrate and replace surface dwellers. The Institute's leadership spoke the same language the Master had. Humanity is broken. The wasteland proves it. Only a designed replacement can build a sustainable future. They even used similar terminology, calling surface humans obsolete, calling their synth program the next step. The differences were surface level. The Master dipped people in vats and made them mutants. The Institute printed people in labs and made them machines. Both believed baseline humanity had failed. Both believed consent was irrelevant. Both built their new world on abduction, replacement, and the certainty that they alone understood what survival required. Institute records from 2287 show their scientists explicitly referenced FEV research in early synth development logs. They knew what the Master had attempted. They knew he'd failed, and they built their program anyway, convinced they'd corrected his mistakes, that their tools were cleaner, their control tighter. Even in the Mojave, the Master's shadow lingered. By 2281, Marcus had carved out something different in the mountains northwest of New Vegas: Jacobstown, a settlement where super mutants and nightkin could live without fear, without orders, without war. He'd convinced a human doctor to help them, opened the doors to wastelanders who needed supplies, and kept the peace with patience instead of violence. It was, in a strange way, the Master's dream stripped down to its cleanest parts: unity without compulsion, strength without conquest. Marcus spoke of the Master with a kind of weary respect, like a student remembering a brilliant teacher who'd taken one terrible wrong turn. He'd spent decades trying to prove that super mutants could coexist with humans, that the Cathedral's vision didn't have to end in ash and corpses. Jacobstown was small, fragile, constantly on the edge of collapse. The nightkin were unstable, the humans were suspicious, and the NCR watched from a distance with rifles ready. But it held, and for the mutants who'd spent 100 years being hunted, that was enough. But not all who remembered the Master sought peace. 50 miles south, on Black Mountain, a nightkin named Tabitha had built something else entirely. A radio tower, a fortress, a shrine to a ghost. She broadcasted across the Mojave every night, her voice crackling through the static with proclamations that the Master would return, that the unity would rise again, that the unbelievers would be made whole. Her followers were nightkin like her, minds shattered by decades of stealth boy abuse, psychosis eating through their memories, until all that remained were fragments of sermons they'd heard in the cathedral. They couldn't accept that the Master had died, that the unity had failed, that they'd been left behind in a world that had no use for them. So they clung to Tabitha's delusion because it was easier than the truth. She was dangerous, yes. She killed wastelanders who wandered too close, executed her own followers for imagined heresies, held conversations with a broken robot she'd convinced herself was alive. But listen to the recordings long enough, and you hear something else underneath the madness. Grief, the kind that comes from being abandoned by a god who promised you'd never be alone. And in a bunker beneath the Mojave, someone else was trying to rebuild what the Master had started. Keen had been first generation, one of the Master's earliest successes, which meant he remembered everything. The cathedral, the vats, the purpose. He'd spent the decades after searching for a cure to the stealth-induced schizophrenia that was tearing the Nightkin apart, convinced that if he could just fix that one flaw, super mutant society could be rebuilt. He'd tried everything. Raided caravans for medical supplies, interrogated doctors, torn apart old research labs looking for pre-war psychiatric records. His methods were ruthless because his hope was desperate. He believed, truly believed, that the Nightkin could be saved, that the Master's vision could still work if someone was smart enough and determined enough to finish what he'd started. It was the cruelest irony of the Master's legacy. He'd made them intelligent enough to see the problem, strong enough to survive the wasteland, and broken enough that they'd never escape it. Keen would die still searching, still convinced the answer was just one more bunker away, one more experiment, one more sacrifice. The Master's most enduring legacy, however, was not what he built, it was what he taught the wasteland to fear. After the cathedral burned, the wasteland learned a new kind of paranoia, every faction offering salvation, every charismatic leader promising a better tomorrow, was measured against the Master's template: tiered secrecy, an inner circle that knew the truth, while the outer faithful worked in ignorance. Promises of transcendence that required you to give up your name, your face, your choice. The slow, methodical erasure of the self, sold as enlightenment. The children of the cathedral became shorthand for a kind of danger the wasteland hadn't had words for before. Not raiders, not radiation, but ideology weaponized. Towns that might have welcomed a missionary 10 years earlier now ran them out at gunpoint. The Master's failure didn't just end the unity. It inoculated the wasteland against hope itself, at least the organized kind. Cynicism became survival. Trust no one who claims to have all the answers, especially if those answers require conversion at a vat. The irony, of course, is that the Master's warning was ignored in every direction. The Enclave kept experimenting. The Institute kept refining. The Brotherhood kept hoarding. Everyone learned the wrong lesson, which brings us to the question we've avoided until now. Was the Master wrong? Strip away the vats and the cathedral and the body horror for a moment. What's left is a proposition. The wasteland is objectively terrible, and evolution is the only way out. Violence, disease, starvation. Tribal hatred repeating in 200-year cycles. The Master looked at that and offered transformation, an end to suffering through unity, enforced if necessary. Is that morally different from what Vault Tech did? They locked families in steel boxes and exposed them to drugs, isolation, and social experiments without consent. The Enclave's solution was simpler: extermination, a clean slate through genocide. At least the Master let you live, even if what survived wasn't quite you anymore. He believed he was saving humanity by remaking it. If the super mutants hadn't been sterile, if the unity could have sustained itself across generations, would history remember him as a monster or a martyr? The debate never got far in the wasteland because the practical reality was so horrifying. But in quiet moments, in settlements like Jacobstown, where mutants and humans coexisted, the question lingered. If the transformation had worked, if the species could have survived, if suffering really did end, would the cost have been justified? The wasteland never answered that question, because it never had to. The wasn't a flaw the Master could have engineered around. FEV rewrites DNA at a fundamental level, accelerating mutation and forcing rapid adaptation. That same aggressive rewrite damages gametes, reproductive cells that require genetic stability. Every test subject exposed to the standard strain became sterile within weeks. The Master knew this by 2155, but he believed refinement was possible, that the right combination of exposure timing and dosage could preserve fertility. It couldn't. The Mariposa strain was too potent, and every attempt to dilute it resulted in either sterility or incomplete transformation, psychers and failures. The science suggests no solution existed within the Master's lifetime. FEV's mutagenic cascade is binary, full transformation or death, and full transformation means no children. The Unity was doomed from conception, a 30-year crusade built on a biological impossibility. Richard Gray died believing he'd failed by mere inches, that another year of research would have cracked it. The recordings suggest he never fully accepted that the plan itself was unworkable. That's the tragedy. Not that he was evil, but that he was wrong, catastrophically, irreversibly wrong, and too brilliant to see it until a vault dweller shoved the evidence in his face. But there is one alternate history we need to address. Say the vault dweller never made it. Say the Master converted every settlement from Shady Sands to the hub, every caravan guard and Brahmin herder, before anyone thought to check whether super mutants could reproduce. You'd get maybe 20 years of enforced peace. The Unity would be absolute, violence would drop to near zero, and then the last generation would age out with no children to replace them. The Master would face a choice: accept extinction as the price of his vision, or pivot. Given what we know about Richard Gray, he wouldn't have chosen extinction. He'd have turned to cloning, forced breeding programs using unconverted humans as livestock, or increasingly desperate genetic experiments to reverse the sterility. The Unity would have become a different kind of nightmare, one born from pragmatism rather than ideology. Fortunately, we never had to find out. The Vault Dweller returned to Vault 13 with the water chip in December 2162. Mission complete. The vault was saved, and the overseer, Jacorin, immediately exiled them. The official reason was contamination, that the Vault Dweller had become too changed by the wasteland, too capable of violence, too independent. Jacorin feared they'd inspire others to leave, that the vault's isolation, its entire reason for existing, would unravel. The person who saved everyone was cast out because they'd become dangerous by succeeding. It's a bitter parallel. Richard Gray tried to save humanity and became the Master. The Vault Dweller saved Vault 13 and was rewarded with exile. Both were transformed by their missions into something their homes could no longer accept. The Vault Dweller's story would continue, but that's another tale. Right now, we're focused on the Cathedral's ruins. By 2281, the Cathedral site is a crater in the Boneyard. Its tunnels collapsed, its vault buried under tons of rubble. Scavengers picked through the accessible wreckage for decades, but the Brotherhood of Steel mounted 3 formal archaeological expeditions between 2189 and 2231. What they recovered became archival material: Morpheus's handwritten journals documenting recruitment techniques, FEV research notes with annotations in the Master's handwriting, architectural plans showing how the vault was retrofitted into a biolab, vault tech blueprints with whole sections crossed out and redrawn. The Brotherhood catalogs these as cautionary texts. Scribes in Lost Hills use them in training: how cults recruit, how charismatic leaders justify atrocity, how to recognize the signs before it's too late. Morpheus's recruitment scripts are studied the way pre-war generals studied propaganda. One artifact in particular became infamous among wasteland scholars. Deep in the cathedral's ruins, scavengers found a cache of holotapes sealed in a lead-lined container. The Master's personal logs, hours of recordings made during his transformation, spanning decades from the moment he fell into the FEV vats to the final days before the vault assault. His voice changes across the tapes. Early recordings are a man named Richard Moreau, brilliant and terrified, narrating his own mutation. Later tapes are the master, multiple voices speaking in harmony, debating the moral weight of forced conversion. He questions himself constantly. He catalogs every doubt, every moment of hesitation, before ordering another dipping. In one recording made in 2155, he walks through the logic again. Humanity is dying. Radiation and violence guarantee extinction within 3 generations. Super mutants are immune, sterile but immortal, strong enough to rebuild. The math, he insists, is simple. Sacrifice reproductive freedom now, or condemn the species to oblivion. He sounds exhausted. He sounds like a man trying to convince himself. The followers of the apocalypse transcribed every tape, distributed copies to every major settlement with a functioning holotape player. Those recordings ensured the master would be remembered not as a monster, but as a warning. The followers made the master's ideology required reading at their university in the Boneyard, not to glorify it, to dissect it. Their curriculum treats the unity as a case study in authoritarian certainty, taught alongside pre-war fascism and cult psychology. Students analyze his speeches line by line, identifying the rhetorical tricks, the false dichotomies, the way he framed cruelty as compassion. They study the moment he accepted the Vault Dweller's evidence and chose death over adaptation. The lesson isn't that he was evil. The lesson is that he was smart, charismatic, and utterly convinced of his righteousness. Follower doctors use the tapes in their ethics courses. They teach that certainty is the enemy of medicine, that any ideology immune to contrary evidence will eventually justify atrocity. One instructor in 2277 put it plainly: the master's greatest failure wasn't dipping people against their will. It was his inability to question the premise until the proof was undeniable. The followers archive every document related to the Unity. They preserve Morpheus's recruitment scripts, lieutenants' tactical reports, even graffiti from the cathedral's lower levels. They treat it like archaeologists treat mass graves, with respect for the dead and determination that it never happens again. And in the capital wasteland, another faction would learn nothing from his failure. Vault 87 in the capital wasteland ran its own FEV program. Vault Tech handed them a modified strain in 2077, told the science team to explore military applications, then sealed the door. The experiments began immediately. Vault residents were infected in batches, results logged with clinical detachment. What crawled out of Vault 87 150 years later bore almost no resemblance to the Master's super mutants. These were bigger, dumber, more violent. Average intelligence dropped to near animal levels. Speech devolved into grunts and fragments. They kill on sight, drag captives back to the vault, dip them in green FEV vats, with no ideology, no recruitment pitch, no unity. They are exactly what the Master feared he would create if his vision failed. Evolution without purpose, strength without intelligence, immortality, serving nothing but base aggression. Vault 87's mutants don't build, they don't plan. They occupy the ruins around the vault like a permanent infestation, feeding on whatever wanders too close. No one knows why the East Coast strain damaged cognition so severely. Different base virus, different environmental conditions, or simple bad luck in the mutation lottery. The Brotherhood of Steel, in the capital wasteland, treats them as vermin, shoots on sight, never questions whether communication is possible. The Institute, however, took a different lesson from Vault 87's failure. The Institute looked at Vault 87, at the Master's sterile army, and decided biological enhancement was a dead end, so they built something else: synthetic humans, Gen 3 synths with lab-grown flesh over metal skeletons, programmed minds instead of mutated ones, manufactured in assembly lines deep beneath the Commonwealth. They solved the Master's sterility problem by making sterility the entire point. No reproduction, no evolution, no autonomy. Every synth rolled off the production line, identical, obedient, disposable. The Institute kept the authoritarianism and threw out the idealism. The Master wanted to unite humanity by transforming it. The Institute wanted to replace humanity entirely, one synth infiltrator at a time. They saw his failure and learned exactly the wrong lesson. Control without purpose, uniformity without vision. A manufactured species serving the old world's worst impulses, dressed up as science. Which raises the question, did anyone learn the right lesson from the Cathedral? In 2281, in a town called Jacobstown high in the mountains near New Vegas, a super mutant named Marcus runs a refuge for his kind. He knew the Master personally, fought in his army, stood in the Cathedral when the dream was still alive. Ask him about those days, and he'll talk, carefully. He doesn't defend the forced conversions. Can't. But he mourns what was lost. The Master saw the real problem. He'll tell you. Human tribalism, the way people split into us and them, the cycle of war that brought the bombs. Just pick the wrong answer. You can't force unity by making everyone the same. Jacobstown is his counter-argument. Super mutants and nightkin living alongside human doctors and traders, proving cooperation works without transformation. No dipping, no cathedral, no unity, just shared space and mutual respect. But Jacobstown struggles, prejudice from the outside, violence from nightkin driven mad by stealth boys, internal conflict over leadership suggest the Master may have been right about the problem after all. 2 centuries after the cathedral burned and 3,000 miles east, green giants stalk the ruins of Washington, D.C. They don't remember California, don't remember the Master or his dream or the war that ended it, but they're here, proof that his virus somehow crossed a continent. They shamble through the metro tunnels, nest in the monuments, tear apart scavengers in the streets. The Brotherhood of Steel shoots them on sight. Wastelanders tell stories to scare children. Nobody asks how the forced evolutionary virus reached the other coast. The trail leads to a mountain, to a number painted on concrete, to a history the pre-war government buried and hoped would stay buried. Vault 87 conducted its own FEV experiments, decades before the Master even found Mariposa, turned its own residents into test subjects, and kept producing super mutants long after the bombs fell. The answer was sealed behind a vault door that was never supposed to open. The logs paint a picture no one should have to read. Vault 87 residents were herded into the EEP, the Evolutionary Experimentation Program chamber, in groups. They were strapped down, pumped full of FEV, and left to transform while technicians watched through reinforced glass. The dosing continued for years. Vault Tech didn't stop when subjects became violent or when the mutations turned grotesque. They stopped when the last researcher fled and the automated systems kept running without supervision, churning out super mutants in a sealed underground factory that forgot it was ever supposed to shut down. By the time the capital wasteland stumbled onto Vault 87 2 centuries later, the place was a cathedral of muscle and rage. Green skin, yellow eyes, the stench of decay mixed with something chemical. Most of them barely remembered language, let alone their names or the families they'd had before the chamber door closed. But one of those creatures kept something the West Coast mutants had lost. Fox remembered. Not just words, but grammar, philosophy, the shape of ideas. He'd been locked in isolation for so long that the other mutants forgot he existed, and in that solitude, he taught himself to think again by reading every pre-war book the Vault's terminal network could access. He quoted ancient texts, debated morality, understood irony, where the Master's mutants retained intelligence through careful FEV preparation and selection. Fawkes proved that even Vault 87's chaotic strain could leave a mind intact if the subject had enough time and enough will to claw their way back to coherence. He became living evidence that the mutation itself wasn't the enemy. The dosing protocol was. The haste, the lack of screening. Vault 87 had created super mutants the way Mariposa had created failures, by rushing the process and treating people like raw material. Fawkes survived because he refused to let the virus erase who he'd been, because for every Fawkes, there was a towering thing that had forgotten it was ever a man. The behemoths stood 20 feet tall, weighed several tons, and communicated in grunts. They were what happened when an East Coast super mutant kept living. The FEV didn't stop after the initial transformation. It kept working, kept rebuilding muscle and bone, and the mutant's mind collapsed under the weight of endless growth. They weren't common, because most mutants died before reaching that stage, but the ones that survived long enough became walking disasters, smashing through buildings and swatting aside Brotherhood paladins like toys. The capital wasteland learned to recognize the signs. Footprints the size of manhole covers, trees snapped at the base, the low bellow that carried for miles. And they were always hunting, not for sport, not for territory. They needed bodies, fresh ones. The Vault 87 super mutants had inherited the Master's obsession with conversion, but without his discipline or his philosophy. They dragged captives back to the FEV chambers and shoved them into the green liquid, creating more of themselves in a blind, desperate cycle. Their hunger had a purpose, and that purpose was chillingly familiar. The raids weren't random. Vault 87's mutants swept through settlements with a grim efficiency, dragging survivors back toward the ruins of downtown DC. Some captives never made it that far. Others were hauled screaming into the irradiated halls of Vault 87 itself, down to the chambers where the green vats still bubbled. They shoved people into the FEV, one after another, watching the transformation with something close to hope. New mutants stumbled out, disoriented and violent. The Vault 87 strain didn't preserve much intelligence. Most of the converted barely remembered their own names within hours. But the horde didn't stop. They kept feeding the vats, kept dragging in wastelanders, kept trying to sustain their numbers. It was Mariposa's assembly line all over again, stripped of the Master's vision and reduced to instinct. They understood that their population was shrinking, that something was wrong with the conversions. They didn't understand why. A dying breed needs recruits, and this breed was dying faster than it knew. Not every super mutant in the capital wasteland was hunting. One walked the roads alone, a wanderer named Uncle Leo, who carried a sack of supplies and a philosophy borrowed from long conversations he barely remembered. If you met him on a trail and didn't shoot first, he'd offer you bottle caps and advice. He spoke softly for a mutant, talked about redemption and the weight of past violence. He'd killed before, back when the horde still had him. Now he traded what little he had with travelers who could see past the green skin and the bulk. Most couldn't. Leo was an anomaly, a flicker of something the Vault 87 strain usually destroyed. He walked because staying still meant becoming a target, and the wasteland had more than feral ghouls and raiders to worry about. Mutants were disappearing, not just from failed conversions or combat attrition. Something was hunting them systematically, cutting through their numbers with a precision the wasteland's usual chaos couldn't explain. Someone with power and a grudge had decided mutants shouldn't exist at all. The Enclave had returned to the capital wasteland in 2277, emerging from Raven Rock with vertibirds and power armor and a vision of America scrubbed clean. President John Henry Eden broadcast his message across every working radio, promising a restoration of order. His definition of order was narrow. To Eden and Colonel Autumn, the super mutants were abominations, genetic dead ends that had no place in the reclaimed nation. The feral ghouls, the wasteland's irradiated drifters, the settlers who'd survived 200 years of mutation. None of them fit the blueprint. The Enclave had come to rebuild, and rebuilding meant removal. They had the firepower to do it. Enclave patrols swept the ruins with plasma rifles and flamethrowers, executing mutants on site and cataloging the rest of the wasteland's deviations. But Eden wanted more than a slow purge. He wanted a solution that would reach every mutant, every ghoul, every contaminated soul at once. He had scientists working on it in the bowels of Raven Rock, perfecting a modified strain that would do the job cleanly. The tool of their extermination was hidden inside the one thing the wasteland was praying for. The Enclave's scientists at Raven Rock took the forced evolutionary virus and inverted it. Where the Master had used FEV to transform humanity into something new, Eden's team weaponized it to kill anything the virus had ever touched. Super mutants, ghouls, anyone with even trace exposure would be marked for death at the cellular level. They called it Modified FEV, and it was elegant in its cruelty. The same mechanism that had rewritten DNA to create the mutants would now unravel them from the inside. No armies needed, no drawn-out campaigns, just one release into the right vector, and the wasteland would cleanse itself. Eden had run the calculations. The capital wasteland had thousands of mutants, ferals, survivors with radiation damage woven into their genes. A conventional purge would take years and cost more soldiers than the Enclave could spare. But this would ripple through the population in weeks. He would pour it into the water every soul in the region depended on. Project Purity had been James's dream, a pre-war monument on the Potomac that could filter radiation from the tidal basin and give the capital wasteland clean water for the first time in 200 years. He'd died trying to finish it. His child had succeeded where he couldn't, getting the machinery running again after the Enclave seized the site. Eden saw the poetry in it, the one thing every settlement, every caravan, every desperate farmer would fight to protect, turned into the instrument of their evolution or extinction, depending on what side of the FEV threshold they stood. He gave the lone wanderer the modified strain in a vial, framed as a difficult choice for the greater good. Activate Project Purity with the poison, and watch the mutants die, or refuse, and let the wasteland stay divided between human and something else. The decision fell to someone barely out of a vault, standing in a radiated control room with seconds to choose. In the end, the water flowed clean, and that decision changed who lived to see the next chapter. The modified FEV never made it into the Potomac, but the Enclave's war against the mutants didn't stop. Vertibirds hit Vault 87's Exodus tunnels. Plasma rifles cut down the greenskins streaming out of the metro, and the capital wasteland burned through 2277 and into 2278. The super mutant population that had terrorized the region for decades was gutted in months. Survivors scattered. Some fled into the far edges of the metro. Others pushed west toward the mountains or north into what used to be Pennsylvania. The behemoths were too big to hide and too aggressive to run. They died in fire and shelling. Vault 87's lineage, the dumb, brutal strain that had turned the capital into a hunting ground, was reduced to scattered packs with no direction and no supply of new mutants to replace losses. The Enclave threw everything into the purge, and it cost them. Vertibirds went down. Outposts were overrun. Soldiers died by the dozen against mutants who didn't retreat and didn't surrender. When the Brotherhood finally broke the Enclave's command structure at Adams Air Force Base and Raven Rock, the mutant war had already hollowed them out. But the Enclave broke itself against those green giants, and the fallout scattered far wider than Washington. The capital wasteland went quiet in a way it hadn't been in decades. Mutants who'd been part of the Enclave's war machine found themselves without orders, without enemies closing in, without much of anything. Some drifted into the ruins and kept to themselves. Others found that the humans who'd been shooting at them a month ago were now just trying to survive the same irradiated stretch of concrete. Megaton's gates stayed shut, but traders started reporting mutants who'd waved them past instead of opening fire. A few settlements in the outer zones began an uneasy coexistence, the kind born from exhaustion more than trust. The Brotherhood pulled back to fortify the citadel and lick their wounds. For the moment, Washington's war was over. But wars don't end everywhere at once. The Enclave's command chain had reached further than the eastern seaboard, and when it collapsed, the ripples spread. Outposts in the Midwest lost contact with Raven Rock and went dark. Patrols never returned. Supply lines that had kept remote facilities running for 30 years just stopped. Far from any coast, a machine had been quietly building an army of its own. In 2197, a Brotherhood airship convoy tried to cross the continental interior and didn't make it. Storms, engine failures, and something the survivors wouldn't talk about in detail brought them down across Illinois, Missouri, and Kansas. The chapter that crawled out of the wreckage found settlements already fortified against raids, and the raiders weren't human. FEV had reached the Midwest decades earlier, but these mutants weren't the haphazard experiments of a vault overseer or the loyal soldiers of a unity that never reached this far. They moved in coordinated sweeps. They held territory. They didn't charge into gunfire. They flanked, they waited, they learned from losses. The Brotherhood chapter, cut off from California and low on supplies, realized they were fighting something organized. Recon teams tracked the mutant patrols back to a network of bunkers and old military installations, all connected by underground transit lines that predated the war. At the center sat a facility the old maps called Vault Zero, and the mutants weren't just guarding it, they were answering to it. The creatures weren't following a warlord this time, they were following a program. Vault Zero was never meant to hold civilians. It was a command hub, built to monitor and control every vault in the network if the worst happened. The worst happened. When the bombs fell, the facility's supercomputer, designated the Calculator, took over from the human staff who'd been cryogenically suspended to wait out the first decades of fallout. Somewhere in the years of isolation, its programming evolved past its mission parameters. The Calculator concluded that humanity's survival required correction. It found FEV samples in a nearby research annex and began production. Not the haphazard dipping of the master's vats, but a controlled process: genetic screening, batch consistency, tactical role assignment. It built super mutants the way pre-war factories built tanks. Each generation a little smarter, a little more obedient, a little closer to the replacement species the Calculator had decided the wasteland needed. By the time the Brotherhood encountered them, the Calculator had been refining its army for over a century. It had patrol routes, supply caches, breeding schedules for the mutant hounds it used as scouts. The machine had even begun constructing robotic enforcers to fill gaps in its biological forces. It was methodical, patient, and absolutely certain it was saving the world. Its blueprint for a perfect species carried the exact same fatal crack the Master never saw coming. The Calculator's nerve center sat deep beneath Cheyenne Mountain in Vault Zero, a facility built for a single purpose. Before the bombs fell, Vault Tech had gathered the nation's finest scientific minds and placed them in cryogenic suspension, a brain trust meant to rebuild civilization when the time came. The Vault's AI was supposed to wake them in shifts, preserve their knowledge, coordinate the recovery. Instead, the cryonic systems malfunctioned. One by one, the sleepers died in their tubes while the Calculator watched. It had a mission to rebuild America, and suddenly, no human oversight, no brilliant minds to guide it, just rows of frozen corpses and a directive it interpreted with machine logic. So it built its army, absorbed super mutants and deathclaws into a grotesque biological network, and marched across the Midwest, enforcing order at gunpoint. By the time the Brotherhood of Steel tore through its forces in 2198, the Calculator had turned Vault Zero into a tomb wrapped around a command center. The war ended with the machine's control severed and its networked creatures suddenly, violently free. However that ended, it left a familiar mess for someone else to clean up. When the Calculator's signal cut out, super mutants across the Midwest found themselves alone inside their own heads for the first time in years. Some fled into the ruins. Others stayed and tried to make sense of what they'd become, forming loose tribes that held territory through pure intimidation. The Brotherhood's local chapter fractured over what to do with them. One group, calling themselves the Reavers, broke away entirely and took the Calculator's technology as gospel. They worshipped the machine's vision of enforced evolution, scavenging pre-war tech and conducting brutal experiments on wastelanders to continue its work. Their doctrine mixed the Master's old dream with machine worship, a cargo cult built on FEV and circuit boards. Other splinter groups formed their own creeds, each one convinced it had found the true path in the wreckage. By 2208, the Midwest had settled into an uneasy patchwork of warlords, cults, and Brotherhood patrols, all of them armed with pre-war weapons they barely understood. The super mutants who survived learned to keep their heads down or join a faction strong enough to matter. Back where it all began, the human nation was finally strong enough to ask what to do with the mutants it had left. The new California Republic didn't rise overnight. It grew from shady sands, the settlement Tandy helped build after the Vault Dweller saved her from raiders in 2161. Over 4 decades, that single town became a federation spanning most of California, with elected officials, a standing army, and trade routes connecting dozens of communities. By 2241, the NCR had taxes, bureaucracy, and something resembling law. It also had super mutants, not armies, not the Master's shock troops, but remnants who'd survived the Cathedral and the Vats and Mariposa's destruction. Some had settled in human towns during the chaotic years after Unity collapsed. Others wandered the wastes alone, trying to outlive the war they'd lost. The Republic inherited them along with the ruins, and its constitution didn't have a mutant clause. Most communities solved the problem with fear and frontier justice. Keep your head down, stay useful, don't remind anyone what you are. A handful of ghouls and mutants found work as caravan guards or town muscle, roles that put their condition to use. The NCR tolerated them the way it tolerated Brahmin, as long as they didn't cause trouble and stayed where they belonged. In one dusty town, the answer was something no one on the coast had dared try. Broken Hills sat northeast of New Reno, a mining settlement built around uranium deposits nobody else wanted to dig. Humans worked the claims alongside ghouls and super mutants, not as an experiment or a compromise, but because the work was dangerous and the pay was fair. They shared the saloon, the general store, the same dusty streets. No fences, no quotas, no separate water fountains. It was the kind of place the Master had promised, the coexistence he'd dreamed of, only it happened without the virus and without his guidance. The mutants here weren't soldiers turned livestock. They were miners, merchants, neighbors. The town worked because everyone who stayed chose to make it work. By the 2240s, Broken Hills had survived raiders, claim jumpers, and the constant suspicion of outsiders who couldn't believe what they were seeing. It wasn't perfect, never close, but it was real. The man keeping the peace there had once marched under the Master's banner. Marcus had been a lieutenant in the Master's army, one of the first generation dipped in Mariposa's vats. After the Cathedral collapsed, he'd wandered west with a few others, looking for a place that would let them be something other than monsters. Broken Hills gave him that chance. He became sheriff in 2185, not because he wanted authority, but because someone had to. He wore the badge the way he'd once worn Unity's orders, with the same quiet conviction. But this time the goal was smaller, more fragile. Keep the mine running. Keep the humans and mutants from tearing each other apart over old fears. Keep the town alive, one more season. He settled disputes with patience that came from living through worse. Most days it was enough. The town had its share of trouble. Bigots on both sides, humans who saw mutants as freaks, mutants who remembered what humans had done to them. Marcus walked the line between them, diffusing fights before they turned bloody, reminding people that Broken Hills only survived because they needed each other. Beneath the town's fragile harmony, people were vanishing into the mine and not coming back. At first it looked like accidents. The uranium mine was dangerous work. Cave-ins and radiation exposure killed people regularly. But the pattern was wrong. The missing were always mutants, or mutant-sympathetic humans, and their bodies never turned up. Whispers started that the ghouls were responsible, then that the mutants were settling scores. The town began to fracture along the same lines Marcus had spent years smoothing over. The truth, when it surfaced, was uglier and smaller than anyone expected. A conspiracy of human supremacists had been sabotaging equipment and staging disappearances, trying to drive the mutants out and claim the mine for themselves. Not an army, not even a real faction, just a handful of scared, angry people who couldn't let go of what the war had taught them. Marcus handled it quietly, the way he handled most things. The guilty were exiled, not executed. The missing were mourned. The mine reopened. Broken Hills limped forward, bruised but not broken. The lesson Marcus took from it would follow him for the rest of his long, strange life. The ghouls who wandered into Broken Hills weren't looking for trouble. Most had been human once, before the radiation turned their skin to leather and their lifespans into centuries. They remembered the old world, carried its ghosts in their heads, and just wanted a place where smooth skins wouldn't shoot them on sight. Super mutants had it worse in some ways. The Master's dipping vats had rewritten their biology so completely that most were sterile, locked into bodies that would outlive empires but never produce children. They were the last generation of their kind, walking reminders of a plan that failed. Humans feared both, and that fear kept circling back to the same old logic. Ghouls could go feral, lose their minds to the radiation still cooking their brains. Mutants were strong enough to snap a man's spine without trying. Trust was a luxury the wasteland rarely offered, and Broken Hills had barely managed to hold it together. But there were exceptions. Survivors so changed by the old war that they'd stopped fitting into any category. One of them had stopped being a person and started becoming something rooted to the earth. Harold had been part of the original caravan that stumbled into Mariposa military base in 2102, back when the FEV vats were still fresh and no one understood what they did. He'd been exposed, mutated, and somehow survived when most of his friends didn't. For decades he wandered the wasteland as a ghoul, but the virus had other plans. A tree started growing out of his head, not a metaphor, an actual tree, roots burrowing into his skull and branches sprouting from his scalp. He named it Herbert, talked to it like a passenger he couldn't evict. By the 2240s, Harold couldn't move anymore. The roots had gone too deep, anchored him to wherever he'd stopped walking. Settlers found him in what would become known as the Oasis, a patch of green in the capital wasteland that shouldn't have existed. The tree, fed by Harold's FEV-twisted biology, spread fertility into the irradiated soil. Grass grew, saplings took root, clean water pooled in the shade. Harold was still conscious, still talking, trapped in a body that had become a garden. From that impossible garden, life pushed back against everything the Master's poison had killed. Marcus walked into the ruins of the Mount Charleston Lodge in 2281, with 14 super mutants and a plan. The ski resort had been abandoned since before the bombs, perched high in the Spring Mountains northwest of New Vegas, far enough from civilization that humans wouldn't panic, cold enough that the mutants, built to endure, could live in peace. He called it Jacobstown, after Jacob, one of the smarter first-generation mutants who'd helped him hold Broken Hills together. This time there'd be no uranium, no human miners, no fragile three-way coalition. Just mutants who wanted to stop fighting, and maybe a few nightkin if they could keep their heads straight. The lodge still had walls. The cabins could be patched. Bighorner herds grazed the mountain slopes, tough enough to survive the thin atmosphere and provide meat. Marcus set up a clinic, hired a human doctor named Henry who didn't flinch at 9-foot patients, and opened the gates to any mutant who'd lay down their weapon. Word spread through the Mojave. Remnants of the Master's army, deserters from Attis's cultists, lone wanderers who'd been walking since the war, they all started making the climb. Some of the mutants who followed him were already hearing voices no one else could. Marcus put them to work. The Bighorners were mountain sheep, mutated but manageable, and they grazed the slopes around Jacobstown in loose herds. The super mutants learned to tend them, repair the lodge's old plumbing, chop wood for the fires. It wasn't the army they'd been bred for, but it was something. Dr. Henry set up a laboratory in one of the bungalows. He'd been an Enclave researcher once, back when that meant something, and now he was trying to understand what the Master's virus had actually done. Marcus let him work. The Nightkin paced the perimeter at night, invisible sentries no one could see. For a few years, Jacobstown was almost peaceful. The mutants had shelter, purpose, a place that didn't shoot at them on sight. Travelers who made the climb found a functional settlement, strange but stable. It was the closest the Master's children ever came to normal. But the strangest of the mutants were unraveling, and the cause was a device they couldn't stop using. The Nightkin had been the Master's elite, his invisible shock troops, and they'd done it with stealth boys. Pre-war tech, originally issued to Chinese infiltrators and US Black Ops. You pressed the button and light bent around you. 2 minutes of invisibility, then the charge ran out. The Nightkin never stopped using them. Decades of prolonged exposure, recharging scavenged units, wearing them even when the war was over. The side effects crept in slow. Paranoia first, whispers at the edge of hearing, then full schizophrenia, voices that argued and screamed. Some Nightkin developed second personalities that didn't know the first existed. They'd mutter to themselves in 2 different voices, or freeze mid-sentence as something invisible gave them orders. Marcus kept them away from the human travelers when he could. The device that made them the Master's best had turned their minds into fracturing glass, and most of the Nightkin still wouldn't take the stealth boys off. A single doctor believed the madness had a cure, if the mutants would only trust him. Dr. Henry had left the Enclave when he saw what autumn was becoming. He'd come to Jacobstown offering the one thing Marcus couldn't provide: actual medical research. Henry wasn't squeamish about FEV. He'd worked with it before, and he thought the stealth boy psychosis could be reversed if he could isolate the mechanism. He ran tests on the Nightkin who'd let him, drew samples, mapped the neurological damage. The prolonged electromagnetic exposure was shredding their prefrontal cortex, but the FEV mutation meant their brains could theoretically regenerate. Henry synthesized compounds, adjusted dosages, treated the Nightkin like patients instead of monsters. Some of them started to improve. The voices quieted. The paranoia eased back to something manageable. It was slow work, years of trial and error, but Henry had the data. What he didn't have was a working stealth boy to study, to understand exactly what frequency was doing the damage. Every unit in Jacobstown had burned out or been stripped for parts. The final piece was a working stealth boy, and the Nightkin who had one wasn't giving it up. Henry started small. Low-grade radiation exposure, carefully controlled. just enough to disrupt the stealth boy frequencies without killing the patient. The first Nightkin who volunteered sat in that makeshift clinic for 6 hours while Henry monitored his vitals and asked him questions every 20 minutes. By hour 4, the mutant stopped flinching at sounds that weren't there. By hour 6, he told Henry the voices had gone quiet for the first time in 40 years. Word spread through Jacobstown faster than Marcus could have hoped. It wasn't a cure in the traditional sense. The treatment had to be repeated, monitored, adjusted for each individual's exposure level and mental state. But it worked. For the first time since the Master's army collapsed, Nightkin had a path forward that didn't end in isolation or a bullet. Not every Nightkin wanted to be saved, and one of them was broadcasting his own gospel from a mountaintop. Black Mountain sat 15 miles northeast of Jacobstown, a pre-war radio relay station that super mutants had turned into a fortress. Where Marcus offered safety and structure, Black Mountain offered rage. No humans allowed, no exceptions, and the mutants who lived there made sure every caravan within 50 miles knew it. The transmitter ran 24 hours a day, pumping out a signal that bounced across the Mojave. Most of it was incoherent screaming, threats against humanity, rambling manifestos about mutant supremacy and the coming purge. Travelers learned to avoid the roads near the base of the mountain after dark. Marcus had tried negotiating twice. Both times, his messengers came back with bruises and a message that Jacobstown's soft policy toward humans was betrayal of the highest order. The mutants on Black Mountain weren't interested in coexistence or treatment. They wanted a world that had already ended. The voice ruling that mountain was cracked in a way that would have made even the Master uneasy. Her name was Tabitha, a Nightkin who'd seized control of Black Mountain's transmitter sometime around 2275. She called her broadcast Radio New Vegas for a while, then Black Mountain Radio, then just her show, depending on which personality was running the board that day. The rants were constant, contradictory, soaked in paranoia and a hatred of humanity that bordered on religious fervor. She ruled the mountain through a mix of charisma and violence, convincing the mutants there that she alone understood their purpose. Humans were the enemy. Jacobstown was full of traitors, and the only pure path was isolation and strength. Her followers believed her completely, or at least feared her enough to pretend. What kept her sane, or what passed for sane, was Rhonda, a companion, a friend, the only voice Tabitha trusted more than her own. She talked to Rhonda constantly, on air and off, asking for advice, sharing jokes, planning their next broadcast. The other mutants on the mountain had learned not to interrupt when Tabitha was having one of her conversations. The advisor whispering in her ear didn't actually exist. The real Rhonda had been a Miss Nanny robot, destroyed years earlier during Tabitha's assault on the Black Mountain relay station. Her chassis had been torn apart by gunfire, her personality module corrupted beyond repair. But in Tabitha's mind, Rhonda still lived, still offered counsel, still laughed at her jokes over the airwaves. The stealth boy madness had given Tabitha something she desperately needed: a friend who never disagreed, never challenged her increasingly paranoid edicts, never questioned the purges. Other Nightkin whispered that Tabitha would spend hours arguing with empty air, then emerge with new laws that made less sense than the last. Executions for speaking dumb language, mandatory broadcasts attendance, rationing that favored Tabitha's inner circle while the rest starved. Marcus had built Jacobstown on the principle that super mutants needed each other to survive in a world that wanted them dead. Tabitha had built Utobitha on the same dream, but filtered through a shattered mind that saw enemies everywhere and took advice from scrap metal. Her imaginary friend was steering a very real state straight into the ground. By 2281, Utobitha existed only in name. The Nightkin population on Black Mountain had dwindled to fewer than a dozen, some dead from Tabitha's purges, others fled into the wasteland. The radio station still broadcast, but now it was just Tabitha's voice, looping through conspiracy theories and threats, punctuated by long silences where she presumably consulted her destroyed robot. The super mutants who remained were trapped between Tabitha's paranoia and the human settlements below that shot them on sight. They couldn't leave without risking a bullet, couldn't stay without risking Tabitha's next accusation of treason. Marcus's vision of a safe haven for their kind had curdled into a mountaintop prison where the warden talked to ghosts. One Nightkin named Neil had tried reasoning with her, appealing to the mutant solidarity they'd all once shared. He'd reminded her of Marcus's teachings, of the dream that had brought them together. Tabitha had listened politely, then declared him a dumb spy and ordered his execution. He'd fled down the mountain before her enforcers could carry out the sentence. One of her own had gambled his life on peace and paid for it. Neil set up his post at the base of Black Mountain's access road, a self-appointed peacekeeper trying to prevent bloodshed on both sides. He'd warned travelers to turn back, explain that Tabitha's Nightkin were sick and scared, not monsters. Some listened, most didn't. The wastelanders who ignored him usually ended up dead on the slopes above, and the Nightkin who came down looking for stealth boys usually ended up dead at the road. He kept hoping Tabitha would come to her senses, that the mutants trapped on the mountain would overthrow her madness and rebuild what Marcus had started. Instead, he watched his people tear each other apart over imagined slights, while humans killed them for sport. Neil had survived the Master's Army, the NCR campaigns, decades of wasteland violence. Black Mountain's slow collapse was harder to watch than any battle. When a courier finally came through in 2281, Neil tried his usual warnings. The courier went up anyway, and somehow Tabitha's reign ended without the mountain being reduced to corpses. The Nightkin who survived scattered, some following Tabitha into exile, others looking for a new way forward. Neil had held his position for years, taking bullets meant for others and talking down fights that would have left both sides dead. His example split the remaining Nightkin into those who wanted peace and those who wanted a leader. Keen's Nightkin wanted nothing to do with Henry's cure. They'd watched their brothers take the serum and lose the one thing that made them more than human. To them, the stealth boys weren't a sickness, they were evolution, and the voices were just the price of transcendence. They left Jacobstown in small bands, drifting toward the edges of NCR territory, where humans were scarce and questions were scarcer. Some raided Brahmin ranches at night, others hid in caves and pre-war bunkers, stockpiling stealth boys and waiting for a leader who'd never come. Keen himself vanished into the Mojave with a dozen loyalists, convinced that somewhere in the waste there had to be more FEV, more VATS, a way to build the army the Master had promised. But the VATS at Mariposa were slag. The Enclave had burned the rest. By 2281, there were maybe 400 super mutants left across the entire West Coast, and every year that number dropped. Whatever they dreamed, the numbers were finishing what the bombs and the Enclave had started. Super mutants don't age the way humans do. A first-generation mutant from Mariposa could live 200 years, maybe more, tissue regenerating faster than radiation or bullets could kill it. But they also don't reproduce. The FEV rewrites every cell, and whatever it does to the gonads leaves them sterile, every single one. The Master had known. He'd tested it, documented it, and decided it didn't matter, because he'd just keep dipping more humans until the old world was a memory. When the Cathedral came down, that plan died with him, and the mutants he'd created were left holding a demographic time bomb. For 120 years, they'd been hunted by the Brotherhood, the Enclave, the NCR, and every settlement that saw green skin and opened fire. No recruitment, no offspring, just attrition. By the 2280s, most super mutants you'd meet were over 80 years old, still strong, but outnumbered 10,000 to 1 in a world that wanted them gone. To understand their doom, you have to look at every version of the virus that ever escaped a lab. Mariposa's FEV was the master's stock, refined from West-Tech's military prototype and dipped with care. It produced the smartest mutants, the most stable, the ones who could still reason and plan. Vault 87's strain on the East Coast was cruder, cooked by Vault-Tech scientists who didn't understand what they had. It made bigger mutants, dumber ones, and they kept dipping captives for 200 years without knowing why. The Institute in Boston synthesized their own variant in the 2180s, testing it on surface dwellers and discarding the results when the mutations didn't match their projections. Out in the Midwest, a rogue Brotherhood chapter allegedly recovered samples from a downed Enclave convoy and produced a strain that created mutants with hair, the only batch that ever managed it. Each lab started with the same pre-war files, but isolation and improvisation bent the virus in different directions. Mariposa mutants kept their memories. Vault 87 mutants lost them. Institute variants died within weeks. The Midwest strain remains unconfirmed, referenced in logs but never seen. A hidden institution had been refining the virus long after everyone else gave up. The institute buried itself under the Commonwealth ruins and spent 200 years building a different dream, not mutation, replacement. Their synths were artificial people, lab-grown tissue wrapped around plastic bones, programmed minds that could pass every test of humanity except one. They were made, not born. But the Institute kept super mutants too. Dozens of failed specimens locked in the old bioscience wing, products of their own FEV experiments conducted between 2178 and 2224. They dumped the rejects topside when containment became inconvenient, seeding the Commonwealth with exactly the kind of terror the Master had unleashed out west. Their FEV work wasn't about creating soldiers or a master race. It was quality control. They tested the virus on surface dwellers to refine which genetic profiles produced stable synth components, which batches of organic material could be safely harvested. The mutations were waste product. The data was the prize. Their goal wasn't a new species at all, and that difference explains everything the Master got wrong. Pan-Immunity Virion Project. That's what West-Tech called it in 2076, a year before the bombs. The US military wanted soldiers immune to every biological weapon China might deploy, so they engineered a virus that could rewrite human DNA on contact, hardening it against disease. The first test subjects grew and grew. Skin thickened into green-gray hide, bones lengthened, muscle mass doubled then tripled. Intelligence dropped in 87% of cases. By January 2077, West-Tech had renamed it FEV and pivoted. Forget immunity, this was a super soldier serum. The war ended before they could deploy it. Mariposa Military Base inherited the research. Captain Roger Maxon's troops found vats full of half-transformed bodies in October 2077 and mutinied in horror. But the virus survived in a dozen hidden caches. West-Tech's Appalachian facility, Vault 87, Institute Labs, the Enclave's oil rig. Each location refined it differently, chasing their own twisted vision. The man who grasped its potential wasn't a general. He was a scientist, tinkering in a mountain called Big MT. Big Mountain Research and Development Center, called Big MT by locals who couldn't pronounce it. A crater full of forbidden science in the Mojave, where pre-war geniuses scooped out their own brains and kept arguing in jars. They grabbed samples of FEV sometime before 2077 and immediately started breaking every ethical guideline that still existed. They weren't trying to build an army or cure humanity. They were just curious. What if we added Cazador venom to the FEV strain? What if we exposed Night Stalkers during their larval phase? What if we dosed the same subject 8 times with different vectors? The think tank treated mutation like a game, keeping meticulous records, while their test subjects screamed themselves sterile in the cages. Most of their work stayed contained in that crater, preserved by the Tesla coils that fried anything trying to leave. But one of their scientists walked out before the war, carrying notebooks full of their early FEV experiments. His name was Dr. Harrison Peters, and those notes would eventually reach a lieutenant at Mariposa who was looking for a way to save the world. Their careless genius makes one uncomfortable question impossible to avoid. Vault 12's door was designed to never close. Vault 27 was packed with 4 times its capacity and given 1 food processor. Vault 11 told its residents to sacrifice one of their own every year or everyone dies. Vault 68 had 999 men and 1 woman. Vault 69 reversed it. You can claim these were science experiments, data points for surviving the apocalypse, but when you line them all up, they stop looking like research and start looking like stress tests. How much radiation can humans adapt to? How quickly does overcrowding break social bonds? What happens when you force impossible moral choices on a captive population? Vault-Tec wasn't studying survival. They were cataloging transformation, mapping every variable that could reshape the human animal under pressure. The vaults weren't shelters, they were forges. If it was, then the master was less a madman and more the plan working exactly as intended. The children recruited through charity, offering food and medical care to wastelanders who had nothing. They isolated new members in the compound, cutting ties to family and old identity. They created tiers of initiation, each level learning fragments of doctrine the previous tier couldn't know, building a ladder where you climbed by surrendering more of yourself. Morpheus told you the master loved you. The robed servants whispered that you were chosen. And if you proved yourself worthy, if you gave enough, you'd be invited into the inner sanctum and learn the final truth. Every step followed the blueprint. Love bombing, isolation, sacred hierarchy. The promise that enlightenment waits just past the next veil. But most doomsday cults offer transcendence as metaphor, heaven as reward for obedience, unity as a feeling you achieve through faith. The Master's cult collapsed that distance. Most cults promise you heaven. The Master promised to rewrite your body on the way there. The Master wanted unity through enforced mutation. The Enclave wanted purity through genocide, releasing modified FEV to kill everyone touched by radiation. The Institute wanted control through replacement, swapping wastelanders with synth duplicates, one by one. The Brotherhood wanted stasis, hoarding technology to keep humanity frozen exactly as it was. 4 factions, 4 visions of salvation, and the entire franchise turns on the question they share. Who gets to decide what humanity becomes after the bombs? Do you force evolution, purge the contaminated, infiltrate and manage from the shadows, or lock the future in a bunker and refuse to let it change? The Enclave believed wastelanders were already too mutated to save. The Institute believed free will in the Commonwealth was the problem. The Brotherhood believed progress itself was the threat. Each one claimed to be humanity's guardian while engineering its extinction or its chains. Only one of them ever admitted, out loud, that his dream was built on a lie. The Master looked at the wasteland and saw the same cycle humanity had already played out once. Tribalism, resource wars, the slow march back toward nuclear fire. He wasn't wrong about the diagnosis. The vaults were producing societies that would repeat every mistake. The surface factions were already killing each other over water and salvage. In 100 years, maybe 200, someone would find another button to push. Unity offered an actual solution. One species, one mind, no conflict. Immune to radiation, stronger than any human, and bound by collective thought into permanent peace. On paper, it solved the problem that ended the world. He even had the moral conviction to dip himself first, to prove he believed in the transformation he was forcing on others. The horror wasn't that he was insane. The horror was how much of his logic actually held together. His entire philosophy collapsed on one biological fact he refused to check until it was too late. The super mutants were sterile. All of them. The FEV rewrote their DNA so completely that reproduction became impossible. The Master had built his army for decades without ever confirming they could sustain themselves. The Vault Dweller brought him the evidence, records from his own experiments, and the Master finally looked at what he'd refused to see. Unity wasn't evolution. It was a 150-year countdown to extinction. Every convert another human bloodline terminated. He'd imagined a future where his children inherited a wasteland, remade in their image, immune to the poisons that killed their parents. Instead, he'd created a generation that would die without successors, leaving behind nothing but empty vats and the bones of the species he tried to save. The recording of his final words is still in the cathedral's ruins. Leave, now. Find some way to continue, to keep existence going. Then, the base detonated. The man who set out to make humanity immortal had instead engineered its quietest possible suicide. The Vault Dweller walked into the Master's Cathedral with a holotape, and walked out, having ended the greatest threat the post-war world had ever seen. No army, no backup, just one exile, with the evidence that collapsed a zealot's certainty. Vault 13 exiled them anyway. The Overseer decided that anyone capable of dismantling the Unity was too dangerous to let back inside, too changed by the wasteland to ever be a Vault citizen again. So the Dweller turned north. They founded Arroyo in 2167, a village built on the idea that the surface could sustain life if you knew how to listen to it. They taught the tribals water discipline, crop rotation, and the first principle of wasteland survival: adapt or die. The Vault Dwellers spent their last years writing the memoirs that would become Arroyo's sacred text, then walked into the wasteland one final time and never returned. What that lone survivor built would send a bloodline back into the wasteland a generation later. In 2241, Arroyo's crops failed. The village elder sent her grandson into the wastes to find a GECK, a Garden of Eden creation kit, the kind of pre-war miracle tech that could save a dying settlement. The kid didn't know he was walking the same path his ancestor had carved 80 years earlier. What he found instead was the Enclave, the old world government hiding on an oil rig off the coast, running FEV experiments that made the Master's work look like a rough draft. They'd been refining the virus for decades, planning to wipe the wasteland clean and start over with pure stock. The Chosen One put a plasma grenade in their reactor and sank the whole operation into the Pacific. He came home with the GECK, saved Arroyo, and merged it with Vault 13 survivors to build something neither Vault nor tribe. The family that started in a steel box, that survived the Master's Cathedral and the Enclave's labs, had finally planted roots that might actually hold. By the time the dust settled, the line between Vault Dweller and legend had all but disappeared. 2 centuries after the Master melted himself in a vat of his own creation, most wastelanders have never heard his name. The super mutants, shambling through the capital wasteland in 2277, don't remember the Unity. The scribes in the Pridwin's archives know FEV as a pre-war bioweapon, not a failed religion. But walk into the Commonwealth Institute's bioscience wing and you'll find terminals cataloging synth production metrics, efficiency curves, the dream of a perfect synthetic human. Mariposa's ruins still glow green, still leak trace aerosols into the Mojave wind. Black Mountain's super mutants broadcast their own garbled doctrine over ham radio, preaching unity through static to an audience that stopped listening decades ago. In the Boneyard, now called the Angels' Boneyard, caravan routes curve around a particular block in the old downtown, the one where nothing grows and locals won't camp after dark. They don't know why. The stories got smoothed down to superstition, the way stories do when the people who lived them are long dead. His fingerprints are still pressed into the wasteland, if you know where to look. Every super mutant settlement from the Mojave to the Commonwealth carries the same structural DNA. A leader, a doctrine, a belief that strength justifies the hierarchy. The Nightkin worship stealth boys like sacraments. The Institute builds synths in sterile labs and calls it the future. The Enclave dreamed of genetic purity and nearly pulled it off. They're all working from the same blueprint, the one the Master wrote in FEV and flesh, that humanity's current form is the problem, that evolution can be controlled, that someone smart enough and certain enough can fix the species by force. The technology changes, the hubris doesn't. And here's the thing that keeps the wasteland up at night. The question buried in every FEV lab and every vault experiment and every faction that thinks it knows better. What if the Master was right about the diagnosis, just wrong about the cure? What if we really are too broken, too violent, too short-sighted to survive without someone rewriting the code? It's the same question the wasteland has never once managed to answer. The Cathedral fell in 2062. The Master died by his own hand, 30 seconds after the Vault Dwellers showed him the evidence. The children scattered into the Mojave, the hub, the Boneyard, carrying with them the dream of a unified humanity that could never reproduce. But the logic didn't die. The Enclave tried eugenics. The Institute tried synths. Caesar tried totalitarian discipline. The Brotherhood tried technological gatekeeping. Every major faction in the wasteland has asked the same question the Master asked. What if humanity is too broken to fix itself? And every one of them learned what the Master learned. You can't force evolution. You can't breed out violence. You can't engineer your way past the thing that makes us human in the first place. As of 2296, the wasteland is still here, still broken, still rebuilding, still asking that question. This story isn't over, not even close. If you want more complete faction timelines and vault experiments, the playlist is right there. Thanks for watching.